I thought the worst thing that could happen was losing my old house to some bogus HOA lawsuit. Turns out that was just the warm-up act. This time, they didn't just send letters, they broke down my damn cabin door. Overwiring. I'm not even kidding. And the wildest part, the person staying in my spare room, let's just say Brenda picked the wrong week to play enforcer. If you've ever dealt with HOA madness or had some clipboard tyrant try to run your life, drop a comment. Seriously, I want to know, what's the pettiest thing they ever hit you for? You're watching QA Stories. My name's Dylan, and I'm 35 years old. I work as a residential electrician, wiring, backup systems, off-grid setups, you name it. Been doing this stuff for over 15 years now, and I'm good at what I do. But here's the thing about being good at electrical work. Just because you can wire up a whole house from scratch doesn't mean you're safe when someone with a clipboard decides they want you gone. I learned that lesson the hard way once before, and I thought I'd learned enough to never let it happen again. Looking back, I should have known better than to think peace was possible when you're dealing with people who get off on controlling others. See, this isn't my first rodeo with a homeowners association from hell. About 3 years ago, I lost everything, and I mean everything, to an HOA lawsuit because I didn't understand their crazy rules. I'd turned that old house into a self-sustaining smart cabin, solar backup, battery walls, inverter rack, the works. HOA said it violated some line about unauthorized energy infrastructure. I fought it for 8 months, burned through my savings on lawyers and still lost. I had to sell the place for less than I owed on it. The final day, I remember standing in my workshop, disconnecting each panel like I was removing a limb from my own body. Every wire I unplugged felt like another piece of my soul being stripped away. Those HOA representatives sat in their black SUVs in my driveway, windows tinted, watching me dismantle everything I'd built with my own hands. They didn't even have the decency to look away while I loaded my life's work into a rented U-Haul. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting back then, or if they really were as power-hungry as they seemed. Turns out I was underestimating them. So when I moved to this quiet suburb 6 months ago, I thought I'd found my sanctuary. Nice little cabin on the edge of the development, far enough from the main neighborhood that I figured I'd be left alone. The previous owner had been some old guy who lived there for 20 years without any problems. I should have asked more questions about why he was so eager to sell. When I toured the place, something felt off though. Faint scratches on the conduit paint, hastily patched holes where battery mounts used to be, fresh paint over what looked like old electrical housing scars. The old man kept glancing toward the main neighborhood, like he was expecting someone to drive up and start asking questions. Maybe I should have just walked away when I saw HO managed community on the real estate listing. I don't know, but the place felt right, you know? Sometimes you walk into a space and it just speaks to you. This cabin had good bones, solid wiring, and enough room out back for my tools, a breaker panel, and a shed I'd turned into a proper repair station. That peace lasted exactly 4 weeks. 4 weeks of thinking I'd finally escaped that whole control game. 4 weeks of believing I could just work on my electrical projects and mind my own business. Then she showed up. Brenda. That's what she told me to call her. Though later I found out everyone in the neighborhood just called her the HOA witch behind her back. 55 years old, former bank manager who'd lost all her workplace power when she retired, so now she channeled every ounce of that control obsession into managing the lives of her neighbors. Always dressed up nice, business casual even when she was just walking around the neighborhood, but she had these beady little eyes that were constantly watching, constantly judging. I actually had to stop and stare at her the first time we met, because the look on her face was so intense it made my skin crawl. The harassment started small, like it always does. Brenda began making what she called courtesy visits to discuss minor compliance issues. My cabin's electrical box wasn't painted HOA gray, and my exterior conduit lines were visually disruptive. She wanted everything changed to approved electrical housing standards only. Then it was my backup power unit. I'd installed a weatherproof battery housing that I was actually proud of. Clean installation, proper grounding, everything up to code. Brenda looked at my outdoor inverter panel and said it disrupted neighborhood uniformity. Seriously? Did she really say that out loud about professional electrical work? I mean, who talks like that about properly installed safety equipment? But the breaking point came when I found this huge violation notice slapped right on my front door. Warning, unpermitted electrical systems violate HOA safety standards, immediate compliance required. I'm standing there looking at this ridiculous piece of paper, staring at my professionally installed backup power system that probably cost more than anything she had on her own property. the work I'd poured my expertise into, treated like some kind of neighborhood safety hazard. During one of her visits, she actually said, "I once managed a $1 million ledger. I know when a panel's non-compliant," which made absolutely zero sense, but she said it with such authority that it took me a minute to process how completely ridiculous that statement was. I wasn't sure if I was being too sensitive about it, but come on, this was licensed electrical work that met every code requirement in the book. That night, I did what I should have done 3 years ago. I sat down and started studying those HOA rules like my life depended on it, because honestly, it felt like it did. All that old trauma came flooding back, the lawyers, the court dates, the sick feeling in my stomach every time I saw an official envelope in my mailbox. I spread those documents across my kitchen table and read every single word, looking for loopholes, looking for protections, looking for anything that might save me from going through that nightmare again. The rules were just as convoluted and contradictory as I remembered from my last place, written in that special legal language designed to confuse normal people. Then the threatening letter arrived, hand-delivered by Brenda herself with this smug smile on her face like she was doing me some kind of favor. After reviewing your electrical compliance history, the HOA board has determined that if immediate corrections to unpermitted systems are not made, the HOA may initiate stronger enforcement measures for safety compliance. I read that phrase about 10 times, trying to figure out what the hell that was supposed to mean. What kind of enforcement does a homeowners association think they can do about properly installed electrical systems? It didn't make sense at the time, but something about the way she said it short-circuited every wire in my body. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe not. But something about her eyes made me double-check the door locks that night. Staring at that threat letter, I felt that old fear creeping back up my spine. The same helpless feeling I'd had when those lawyers were circling my last place like vultures. Should I just back down like I did before, give in to their demands and hope they'd leave me alone? Or was this finally my chance to fight back? I honestly wasn't sure I had the strength to go through another legal battle, but I also knew I couldn't keep running from these people forever. Something had to give. I sat there staring at the letter long after she left, replaying the sound of her heels on gravel, each step like a countdown I couldn't stop. I'd been here before, and last time, I didn't fight back. I was still trying to figure out my next move when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, about a week after Brenda had delivered her threat letter, when this guy knocked on my door. Professional looking, maybe 40 years old, wearing one of those crisp white button-down shirts that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. He had this expensive steel watch on his wrist and carried himself like someone who was used to having real authority, not the fake kind that comes from bossing around homeowners. When he introduced himself as Garrett, I figured he was probably another lawyer or maybe someone from the county offices. I wasn't expecting what came next. "I'm a federal investigator," he said, showing me his credentials. "On administrative leave right now. Working cases tied to utility contracting fraud and infrastructure abuse. I'm looking for a quiet place to stay for a few weeks while everything gets sorted out." Now, I'm not usually the type to let strangers crash at my place, but something about Garrett felt solid. Maybe it was the way he looked me straight in the eye when he talked, or maybe it was just that I was tired of dealing with all this HOA garbage alone. Still, something nagged at me. After he settled into the guest room, I found myself Googling his name on my laptop. Nothing came up. No social media, no news articles, no digital footprint at all. No LinkedIn, no press mentions, not even a blurry ID photo. It was either the cleanest cover I'd ever seen, or he was exactly who he claimed to be and dangerously good at disappearing when needed. Still, part of me wanted to ask him why he really chose my cabin, but I didn't. That either meant he was exactly who he said he was, or he was very good at hiding who he really was. Looking back, I still can't believe I said yes that quickly, but sometimes you just get a feeling about people. Plus, if I'm being honest, having a federal investigator around seemed like it might make Brenda think twice about whatever stronger enforcement measures she was planning. Garrett moved into my spare room that afternoon, and I have to say, it was nice having someone around who didn't seem interested in controlling every detail of how I lived my life. He kept to himself mostly, worked on his laptop, made phone calls in low voices that I tried not to eavesdrop on. But on his second day there, something happened that made me realize I'd stumbled into way more than just a temporary roommate situation. I was showing him some of the HOA documents Brenda had been bombarding me with, mostly just venting about how ridiculous their rules were, when Garrett suddenly got very interested. Very interested. "Dylan," he said, squinting at the papers, "when did you receive these?" So I told him about the timeline, the first visit, the violation reports about improper circuit housing, exposed cabling, non-standard enclosures, the threatening letter. He started examining everything more closely, pulling out this magnifying glass thing and studying the documents like they were evidence in a crime scene, which, as it turned out, they basically were. These PDFs were altered recently. See the digital signature on this electrical inspection form? It was forged, he said after about 20 minutes of careful inspection. I actually had to stop and stare at him after that one. At first, I thought he might be making it up to impress me or something. My mind went to those TV shows where someone claims to be an expert and then gets exposed as a fraud. Wait, she altered a document just to find me over how I wired an exterior breaker box? But then Garrett pulled out his phone and showed me a case study from one of his previous investigations, walking me through the forensic markers that proved document tampering. The guy clearly knew what he was talking about. That's when I started understanding that Brenda wasn't just some power-hungry neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was actually breaking laws to harass me. Federal laws, according to Garrett. Document tampering, fraud, abuse of authority. The list kept growing as he dug deeper into the paperwork. I wasn't sure if I should feel vindicated or terrified that I'd somehow attracted the attention of someone willing to commit actual crimes just to mess with my electrical installations. It didn't make sense at the time, but Garrett seemed to think there was more going on than just a personal vendetta against my backup power systems. Late that night, after Garrett had gone to sleep, I sat in my kitchen with the HOA rulebook spread out again. I wasn't looking for clarity this time. I was looking for where she'd twisted the rules, what she'd weaponized. The HOA documents weren't laws, they were traps, and I was done stepping into them blind. But the more I read, the more obvious it became. It was never about the wiring. It was about power, and who got to decide whose home stayed standing. The realization hit me like a surge through a bad circuit. This isn't about my wiring being wrong. This is about someone who wants to use rules as weapons. I closed the book and sat there in the dark, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach from 3 years ago. Except this time, I had someone on my side who actually understood how these people operated. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet, honestly. Brenda hadn't shown up for her usual courtesy visits, and I was starting to wonder if maybe seeing Garrett around had spooked her. Then the formal letter arrived. Hand-delivered again, but this time, Brenda didn't knock. This time with compliance tips. She showed up like she ran the block. That same clipboard clutched like a judge's gavel. I need to inform you that your temporary guest appears to be operating a non-permitted technical service. HOA requires full disclosure of any on-site business or mechanical activity, she announced, holding out an official-looking envelope. I wished I could tell you I kept my cool, but come on, who wouldn't snap at that level of bureaucratic insanity? Brenda, I said, this is my house. I don't need your permission to have friends stay over. But she just smiled that cold smile and tapped the envelope against her palm. According to HOA Covenant Section 12.4, all occupancy changes must be pre-approved to maintain community safety standards. Your guest has until Friday to provide proper documentation or he'll need to leave the premises. That can't be right, can it? I mean, even HOAs can't control who visits your own home, right? But the way she said it, so confident and matter-of-fact, made me wonder if maybe they actually could. Maybe I should have just told her to get lost right then and there. I don't know. That's when Garrett stepped out onto the porch, still wearing that crisp white shirt, and gave Brenda this ice-cold stare that made the air around us feel about 10 degrees colder. Unauthorized inspection attempts on private electrical systems could violate multiple codes, ma'am. You really want to push this? I honestly wasn't sure if he was bluffing or not, but the look on Brenda's face suggested she wasn't willing to find out. She took a step back, clutching that envelope against her chest like it was some kind of shield. You'll regret not cooperating, Mr. Henderson. This was your last chance, she said, which sent chills down my spine anyway. Then she marched away, but not before taking several photos of my porch, my breaker panels, conduit work, external wiring. Looking back, I should have realized that those photos weren't just for her HOA files. She was building some kind of case, gathering evidence for whatever she was planning next. Watching Brenda march away with that look of pure rage on her face, I realized this wasn't just about an angry neighbor anymore. But was Garrett really my guardian angel? Or had I just painted an even bigger target on my back? The escalation started the next morning with what Brenda called an emergency security installation. I woke up to the sound of power tools and looked out my window to see two guys in work uniforms mounting this large security camera on a utility pole. Nothing weird about that, except the camera was aimed directly at the outdoor electrical unit by my workshop door. Not the street, not the general area, my power systems specifically. When I went outside to ask what was going on, one of the workers showed me a work order from the HOA requesting enhanced surveillance of problem properties for community safety purposes. Problem properties. That's what they were calling my home now. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but something about that camera made my skin crawl. It was one of those big, obvious ones that moved and tracked movement, and every time I walked out to check my circuit panel, I could hear it adjusting its position to follow me. The thing hummed when it moved, this low mechanical whir that cut through the morning quiet like a dentist's drill. I found myself changing my routines to avoid walking past it, taking the long way around to my workshop, checking the mail from inside the house. Garrett noticed it too, and the expression on his face when he saw it was, well, let's just say it wasn't the look of someone who thought this was normal HOA behavior. That lens is fixated on your circuit panel, Dylan. That's not about safety, it's surveillance, he said quietly. One afternoon, Garrett walked outside with a towel and casually draped it over the camera lens. Within 5 minutes, Brenda was calling my house phone, demanding he remove the obstruction to community safety monitoring equipment. I actually had to stop and think about that for a minute. What's the difference? But then I realized, security cameras watch for problems. This thing was watching me specifically, like I was the problem. The power situation came next. Wednesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, my electricity just cut out. No storm, no construction in the area, just sudden darkness in the middle of a perfectly clear day. I called the power company, and they told me there was an HOA odd utility isolation for unauthorized grid connections. Your power system was flagged as non-compliant, so they ordered it cut off, they explained. The power came back on 6 hours later, just long enough for all my food to spoil and my computer to lose the electrical schematics I'd been working on. As the lights flickered back on, I sat in my dark kitchen and felt that same helpless rage I'd experienced 3 years ago when the lawyers started circling my old place. I found myself reaching for my tools instinctively, wanting to check connections, trace circuits, do something useful with my hands. Then I stopped, unsure whether it was worth fighting again. Was I just setting myself up for another legal disaster? Coincidence? I was starting to think not. That's when Garrett and I decided to dig deeper into the HOA's activities. He had this way of looking at documents that I'd never seen before, like he was reading between the lines for secrets. And what we found, man, I wish I could tell you I was shocked, but after everything that had happened, it was starting to make sense. Hidden in the HOA financial records were receipts that made no sense at all. They logged $6,000 in electrical upgrade labor for a month when no licensed contractor ever stepped foot on the property, Garrett pointed out, running his finger down a column of expenses. There's also a line item for transformer testing, but your HOA doesn't even have buried transformers. During this investigation, I had an odd encounter with Mr. Peterson, this quiet guy who lived 3 houses down. He stopped me while I was checking my mailbox and said, almost in a whisper, "Brenda's gotten too bold lately. Not everyone on the board agrees with what she's doing to you." He glanced over his shoulder like someone might be listening. I joined the board to help clean up broken sidewalks, not to watch Brenda break people. Then he walked off before I could ask more. "This is our smoking gun," Garrett said, spreading the evidence across my kitchen table. "Financial fraud, document tampering, and now targeted harassment. She's building a pattern of illegal behavior that goes way beyond just being a difficult neighbor." I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or terrified. On one hand, we finally had proof that I wasn't crazy, that Brenda really was breaking laws to mess with me. On the other hand, people who are willing to commit crimes to get what they want probably don't just give up when they get caught. They escalate. Looking back, I should have realized that cornering someone like Brenda would only make her more dangerous. The anonymous warning came Thursday night, delivered through an email to Garrett's federal account. "She's going way too far with this. Not everyone on the board agrees with what she's doing. You need to be careful." No signature, no identification, just a warning from someone inside the HOA who was apparently watching everything fall apart. Garrett showed me the email, and I could see the concern in his eyes. "Looks like someone on the inside's watching Brenda lose control. This goes deeper than power lines, Dylan," he said, staring at the screen with that investigator look I was getting used to seeing. That night, I had the strangest dream about my old cabin. I was standing in the workshop watching it burn while HOA officials in dark suits stood around taking notes on clipboards. The flames were eating through the solar panels, melting the battery housing, turning everything I'd built into twisted metal and ash. I woke up in a cold sweat and found myself walking outside to check my outdoor panels, making sure they were still intact, still mine. The security camera tracked my movement with that mechanical whir, its red light blinking like a malevolent eye in the darkness. I spent that night staring out my window at that security camera, watching its little red light blink in the darkness. The power was back on, but I kept thinking about how easy it had been for them to cut it off. How easy it would be to cut it off again, maybe at night, maybe when I was alone. Word got back to us through neighbors that Brenda was telling people she had a plan to permanently solve the Dylan and Garrett problem. That phrase, permanently solve, hit like static under the skin. Too casual, too calculated. Look, I never wanted to turn my home into some kind of war zone. I just wanted to wire up electrical systems and mind my own business. But she was literally building battle lines around my property. Cameras, power cuts, official harassment letters. It felt like living under siege by someone who thought HOA authority gave her the right to do whatever she wanted to whoever she wanted. It wasn't a zoning issue anymore. This was a siege, executed with paperwork, surveillance, and slow, deliberate psychological wear down. That night, staring at all the evidence we'd gathered, I had a choice to make. Keep my mouth shut and hope she'd just leave us alone, or use what we knew to end this whole thing once and for all. Looking back, I should have known that people like Brenda don't just leave you alone. They escalate until someone stops them. Friday morning started with an eerie calm that made my stomach twist into knots. I was in my workshop, splicing wire into a backup load panel, trying to focus on getting the connections clean, when I heard the wind pick up outside. Not unusual for late fall, but something about the sound made me pause. My cabin door hinges started creaking softly in the breeze, and I glanced toward the house to see Garrett standing at the kitchen window. He caught my eye and gave me this knowing nod. We both sensed something big was about to go down. The morning air felt too still, like that heavy quiet right before a storm breaks. Even the birds had stopped chirping. I found myself checking the locks on both doors twice, something I hadn't done since the first week after Brenda's threats started. This feels wrong, I muttered to myself, wiping sweat off my palms despite the cool morning air. Garrett walked over from the kitchen window, his expression grim. "They're not going to ask permission this time, are they?" he said quietly, staring out at the empty street. I wasn't sure if it was intuition or just paranoia after everything that had happened, but the air felt charged, like right before a thunderstorm hits. We both knew something was coming, but neither of us was prepared for how brazen it would be. The knock on my door came around 11:30, but it wasn't really a knock. It was this authoritative pounding that made my whole cabin shake. I looked out the window and saw Brenda standing there with two guys in HOA maintenance uniforms, both carrying clipboards and wearing serious expressions. Behind them was a utility-branded pickup with orange cones and a mounted voltmeter rig, just official-looking enough to be dangerous. Brenda was dressed in her usual business casual outfit, but she had this triumphant look on her face that made my blood run cold. This wasn't another courtesy visit, this was something else entirely. "Dylan Henderson," she announced when I opened the door, reading from an official-looking document. "I'm here to conduct a mandatory electrical safety inspection under HOA Compliance Code 14.7. This inspection is required for all properties that have received multiple violation notices." I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. Mandatory electrical safety inspection? Brenda, I've never heard of any Code 14.7, and you're not a licensed inspector. None of this equipment has been authorized through proper utility channels, but she just smiled that cold smile and gestured to her maintenance guys. Updated HOA regulations grant administrative enforcement rights in all cases of unregistered electrical infrastructure. My hand went to my phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call screen. But then I hesitated, remembering how useless emergency response had been last time. The police had basically shrugged when the HOA lawyers showed up with their paperwork 3 years ago. Do I call the system that failed me before, or trust the guy sleeping under my roof with a federal badge and a mystery past? When I refused to let them in, because seriously, what choice did I have? Brenda's expression shifted from smug confidence to pure rage. "If you don't comply voluntarily, we have the authority to conduct the inspection anyway. This is about community safety, not your personal preferences." That's when I realized she wasn't bluffing. She actually believed she had the legal right to force her way into my electrical workspace. Maybe I should have just called the police right then and there, but everything was happening so fast, and part of me still couldn't believe she'd actually go that far. I wasn't sure if I was underestimating her again, or if she was really as unhinged as she seemed. That's when she nodded to her maintenance workers and they moved toward my side workshop door that led to my inverter bay, the door I used for bringing equipment in and out, the one that led directly into my main electrical workspace. I heard them talking in low voices, something about structural integrity concerns and emergency access protocols. I stood frozen as the maintenance guys whispered to each other. One tapped the crowbar against his boot. Garrick hadn't moved. Neither had I. This wasn't theater anymore. It was about to be force. The door I'd built myself with my own hands after losing everything at the last house. Solid oak frame, reinforced hinges, professional deadbolt. It represented everything I'd rebuilt, everything I'd fought to protect. Then came the sound I'll never forget. The crowbar punched straight through the latch and the door frame exploded, sending wires, screws, and splinters everywhere. They didn't even try to pick the lock or find a key. They just used brute force, and boom. The whole thing burst open with this violent crash that echoed through my workshop. As the wood splintered and metal screamed, I felt that same sick violation I'd experienced 3 years ago when the lawyers came with their eviction papers. This wasn't just a break-in, it was a repeat trauma, watching someone destroy what I'd built with my own hands for the second time in my life. She didn't even try to knock first, I muttered to myself, watching electrical components scatter across my floor. She found some bureaucratic way to make her completely illegal break-in look official. But the worst part wasn't the broken door or even the violation of my space. It was the look of pure satisfaction on Brenda's face as she stepped over broken surge protectors, looked around at the panels on the wall, and acted like she knew what any of it meant. "I have visual authority," she announced, marching into my workshop with her clipboard held high like some kind of weapon. "I am the HOA authority here, and this property falls under my jurisdiction." I'm watching this woman step into a live workspace with active wiring, open breakers, and no clue what she was stepping into, and she doesn't even realize it. She flinched slightly when a spark jumped from an exposed inverter connection, but pushed through anyway, determined to look official. She's so drunk on her own perceived power that she can't see how far over the line she's crossed. You know, I've shared stories like this on QA Stories before, people getting so caught up in their little positions of authority that they forget there are bigger authorities out there. But I never imagined I'd actually be living through one myself. Standing there in my destroyed doorway, watching Brenda rifle through my electrical equipment like she was conducting some kind of legitimate investigation, I felt this strange mix of rage and anticipation. It was like watching someone reach for a high-voltage panel with wet hands and a blindfold. What would you do in that exact moment, I wondered, looking at the splintered remains of my door and the scattered electrical components? Call the cops immediately, or just let her keep digging her own grave? Because that's exactly what it felt like, watching someone dig their own grave with every illegal step they took deeper into my workspace. As Brenda moved deeper into the workshop, stepping over cable housing and electrical meters like they were beneath her notice, I found myself backing away slowly, not in fear, but with calculated anticipation. I could feel Garrett somewhere behind me, probably watching from the kitchen doorway. "Keep walking, lady," I whispered to myself, gripping a broken surge protector tight enough to leave marks on my palm. "You're almost there." Brenda stood there facing the front hallway, right next to the main fuse cabinet where Garrett was waiting, completely unaware that she'd just walked into something way bigger than an electrical violation dispute. Standing there in my destroyed doorway, I knew this was the moment when everything would change forever. But would it change in my favor, or was I about to lose everything all over again? The police showed up about 10 minutes after Brenda broke down my door, which tells you something about how loud that whole confrontation was getting. 2 officers looking tired and annoyed, like they'd been called out for another ridiculous neighbor dispute. I wasn't sure if someone had called them or if they'd just heard the shouting from the street, but seeing those uniforms walk up my driveway made my stomach drop. They found me standing just inside the side workshop, next to a broken breaker box and a pile of destroyed conduit. Here I was, with federal investigators staying in my guest room, my workshop door busted open, and an HOA president ransacking my electrical equipment. The first officer, a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, glanced around at the chaos and immediately started questioning me. "Sir, are you the property owner here? We've received reports about some kind of electrical dispute and someone possibly squatting in abandoned infrastructure. How the hell was I supposed to explain this situation without sounding completely insane? Officer, this is my home and my legally installed electrical workshop. That woman broke down my door without any legal authority, I said, pointing at Brenda, who was still holding her clipboard like it was some kind of shield. The officer looked skeptical, probably thinking I was just another crazy homeowner making up stories about HOA harassment. That's when he turned to Garrett and his whole demeanor shifted. Sir, we've also received reports of someone impersonating a federal officer. I'm going to need to see some identification. I watched Garrett's face carefully, trying to read his expression. Was he about to get arrested? Was his whole federal investigator story just some elaborate con? Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts about him, but in that moment, with cops and HOA officials and broken doors, I honestly wasn't sure what to believe about anything anymore. That's when Garrett calmly reached into his wallet and pulled out his credentials. But he didn't just flash them quickly. He took his time, deliberately unfolding his badge wallet with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. You might want to take notes, he said in that calm, professional voice I'd gotten used to hearing. Not just any credentials, an official federal investigator badge and identification card that made both officers straighten up and take notice. A vast array of officers stood on stage around the room, and Aaron told us it would take roughly an hour. Special Agent Garrett Morrison, under temporary leave, formerly lead investigator on federal energy fraud and infrastructure laundering cases, he said, handing over his identification for proper inspection. I'm here as a civilian guest, but I've been documenting what appears to be fabricated electrical compliance reports, falsified HOA inspection logs, and fraudulent budget entries for non-existent equipment. The change in the officers' attitudes was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, Brenda wasn't the authority figure in the room anymore. I watched Brenda's face as the reality hit her in slow motion. First shock, her mouth actually dropping open like a cartoon character. Then panic as her eyes darted between Garrett's badge and the officer's suddenly serious expressions. Then desperate denial as she started shaking her head frantically. No, that's impossible. Who the hell are you really? She demanded, but her factory floor voice cracked for the first time, the way I imagined it must have when the audits caught up with her 10 years ago. But Garrett wasn't done. He pulled out his phone and started playing audio recordings, conversations where Brenda was planning to adjust the electrical compliance numbers to cover her theft, video footage of her ordering my workshop door to be forced open without any legal authority. In the background, you could hear my voltage alarm going off as the door was breached. Then came the physical evidence. Garrett unrolled blueprints of forged permits across my damaged workbench, fired up a portable speaker to play back recorded phone calls, and handed over a thick folder marked fraud, evidence logging in official federal lettering. Complete financial fraud documentation that he'd been collecting for weeks while staying at my place. One of the officers muttered, "Holy hell," as he flipped through page after page of fabricated inspection reports and falsified budget entries. I actually had to stop and stare at him as the evidence kept coming. This wasn't just some random federal agent who'd stumbled into my housing dispute. This was someone who'd been building a case against Brenda the entire time. This incident gave me the documented abuse of power I needed to expose this HOA's connection to broader energy contracting fraud, Garrett explained to the officers while Brenda stood there looking like her whole world was collapsing. Brenda here isn't just some power-hungry HOA president. She's part of a network that uses homeowners associations to launder money through fake electrical upgrade projects. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or manipulated. Had Garrett been using me as bait this whole time? Or was I just lucky enough to stumble into the right help at the right moment? The look on Brenda's face when she realized what was happening. Man, I wish I could describe it properly. Pure shock, then denial, then this desperate kind of panic as she understood that her little power trip had just collapsed around her. All that authority and confidence had evaporated the moment real law enforcement got involved. "Brenda," I said, finally finding my voice again, "you don't get to bypass every code just because you've got a clipboard and a fake permit." As the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, I found myself gripping that broken surge protector like it was some kind of trophy. The sound of those cuffs snapping closed took me back to my old cabin for just a second. Instead of watching HOA lawyers walk away with their briefcases full of legal papers, I was finally seeing real consequences for real crimes. Have you ever wanted to see someone's face the exact moment their whole world comes crashing down around them? Because that's exactly what I was witnessing. Brenda went from smug HOA dictator to panicked criminal in the span of about 5 minutes. The handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in months, maybe years. She was cuffed right under the same sign that read high voltage, authorized personnel only. Ironic, considering how unauthorized her whole career had just become. Not just arrested, undone. All that trauma from losing my previous home, all the fear and helplessness I'd felt dealing with her harassment, it all finally felt worth it when I saw her power trip ego get crushed by real consequences. The so-called maintenance crew dropped their multimeters and ran like they'd seen a live wire arc. The utility truck disappeared faster than you'd believe possible, and Brenda, the woman who'd terrorized me with violation notices and illegal surveillance, got stuffed into the back of a police car like any other criminal. Watching those handcuffs snap closed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pure satisfaction. But as the police car pulled away, Garrett gave me this strange look, part warning, part regret. "This was the easy part," he said quietly, staring after the disappearing taillights. "The paper trail ends here, but someone paid her to push this hard, and I don't think they're done with you yet." Was this really justice, or just the calm before an even bigger storm was about to hit? Because something in Garrett's expression told me there was still more to this story than I'd realized. The news of Brenda's arrest spread through the neighborhood faster than I thought possible. By Saturday morning, I had neighbors I'd never even met knocking on my door wanting to know what had really happened. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who'd been dealing with her harassment and illegal tactics. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, this sweet elderly couple from 2 streets over, came by with coffee and a stack of violation notices that told the whole story. They'd been forced to remove their solar inverter system after 3 years of saving for it, then got cited for running a backup generator, too close to the property line. Another neighbor down the street had been fined for motion-activated lights that were too bright for community mood lighting. Brenda made each family think they were the only ones having problems, the only ones being difficult or non-compliant. "We always thought something wasn't right about her," Mrs. Smith told me, sitting at my kitchen table while her husband examined my broken door. "But we didn't know who to complain to since she was the one in charge of complaints. Hard to report someone when they're the same person filing, approving, and enforcing the complaints. That's the thing about people like Brenda. They count on their victims feeling isolated and powerless. But once word got out about the arrest, story after story started emerging about her reign of terror. I was getting a dozen visitors a day, all sharing their own horror stories about Brenda's harassment campaigns. And honestly, part of me was still keeping my distance from all the community solidarity. Maybe they meant it this time. Or maybe I was just the flavor of the week. I'd seen loyalty evaporate before. Just ask anyone. Whoever had crushed before me. The one thing I did decide to do was repair my workshop door, but not in the way you might expect. I kept the broken wood and the busted electrical housing, welded them into a steel frame with a sign that said, "Boundary crossed here, line restored." I called it the break point. Not about showing off or making some grand political statement, but about remembering that some lines should never be crossed. When Mrs. Peterson asked about it during one of her visits, I told her it was a reminder that when lines do get crossed, there have to be consequences. Every time I looked at that memorial piece, I was reminded that I'd finally stood up to someone who thought they could abuse their authority without any pushback. Garrett decided to stick around and help get the community stabilized while everything got sorted out legally. Turns out, the fraud wasn't just budget padding. Garrett said the cabin wasn't just a hideout, it was the linchpin in a much bigger grid. "This is bigger than just your neighborhood dispute," he told me, as we watched more federal agents conducting interviews throughout the community. Brenda was just a low-voltage fuse in a high-voltage circuit of corruption. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse about everything that had happened. On one hand, it meant my harassment wasn't personal, I was just convenient target. On the other hand, it meant there were a lot more people like Brenda out there, using their little positions of power to make life miserable for regular homeowners. The new HOA board that got elected was night and day compared to Brenda's administration. They immediately repealed all her ridiculous aesthetic rules and started focusing on actual community improvements instead of petty enforcement actions. My electrical installations were officially declared a professional addition to neighborhood infrastructure. The security camera that had been watching my circuit panel got moved to monitor the actual community entrance where it belonged. And slowly, gradually, the neighborhood started feeling like a place where people actually wanted to live instead of a place where they had to walk on eggshells to avoid violation notices. But even with all the positive changes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this whole nightmare wasn't really over. Looking at my rebuilt door with its meaningful memorial message, I thought about how this all started with something so simple: proper electrical work on my own property. How quickly it escalated from aesthetic complaints to document fraud to federal crimes. It made me realize that the biggest battles in life sometimes start with the smallest violations of basic respect and human dignity. This didn't start with fraud. It started with a line drawn on a blueprint by someone who thought nobody would check the wiring. Looking back, I realized there was still something big Garrett hadn't shared with me yet, something about why he'd really chosen my cabin as his temporary refuge. 3 weeks after Brenda's arrest, Garrett finally told me the whole truth about why he'd ended up at my cabin. We were sitting on my back deck, drinking coffee, when he pulled out this thick file folder I'd never seen before. "Dylan," he said, "there's something I didn't tell you about why I really came here. This wasn't just about finding a quiet place to stay while my suspension got sorted out." The serious look on his face made my stomach twist. Had I been played this entire time? Was my whole HOA nightmare just some kind of setup for a larger investigation I didn't know about? "We didn't just find you, we picked you. The forgery, the fines, even Brenda. They needed someone smart enough to see the pattern, but not smart enough to disappear before it unfolded," Garrett continued, spreading documents across my patio table. I found myself withdrawing slightly, not speaking for a beat. They chose me because I'd already lost once. This wasn't just about HOA fines. This was about a network siphoning funds through fake infrastructure upgrades. Mostly electrical, mostly invisible unless you knew what to look for, Garrett continued. "We've been tracking this operation for 18 months, and your harassment complaint was the break we needed to get someone inside the system." I actually had to stop and stare at him after that revelation. My electrical violation notices, my broken door, my months of terror, all of it had been part of a federal investigation into organized crime disguised as suburban bureaucracy. The scope of what Garrett showed me was mind-blowing. Lists of HOA officials across 3 states, all connected through a web of financial fraud that stretched from local community boards all the way up to county government offices. Bank account records showing millions of dollars being moved through fake contracts. Underground cabling for parks that didn't exist, smart lighting systems that were only on paper, transformer maintenance logs with no matching service records. And right in the middle of it all was Brenda, using her position as HOA president to legitimize financial transactions that were actually funding everything from political corruption to money laundering for much bigger criminals. They knew nobody questions HOA spending when it says community safety or grid resilience. It was the perfect paper shield, Garrett explained, running his finger down columns of fabricated expenses. Community improvement fund for electrical upgrades? Sounds legitimate. Emergency grid maintenance contract to prevent blackouts? Makes perfect sense. Inspection fees for code compliance? Totally normal. But when you added up all those small, reasonable-sounding expenses across dozens of HOA communities, you were looking at a sophisticated criminal enterprise. That's when the final avalanche started. Within 72 hours of Garrett revealing the full scope of the investigation, federal agents conducted coordinated raids across 3 counties, 12 arrests, 3 states. Every thread Garrett had tracked came undone at once. Brenda, it turned out, was just the local face of an operation that reached all the way to state-level political corruption. Watching the news coverage of all those arrests, I realized my broken door had been the thread that unraveled an entire criminal network. Brenda's complete downfall was swift and devastating. She got sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for fraud and property destruction, but the real punishment was everything else that came after. She was ordered to pay $47,000 in restitution to victims, including $8,000 directly to me for the door damage and harassment. When she declared bankruptcy and lost her house, I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and pity. The final insult came when Brenda's mugshot got printed in the HOA's final newsletter, under the title, "Compliance and You." Watching someone who'd seemed so powerful become completely shunned by the entire community, people literally crossing the street to avoid her, was justice, but it was also kinda tragic. The last I heard, Brenda was working part-time at a hardware store, right next to the aisle where the conduit and breaker boxes are. Funny how things come full circle. She flinches whenever someone walks past in a polo shirt with a badge lanyard, like every clipboard is a warrant now. It's hard to feel too sorry for someone who made so many people's lives miserable, but seeing how completely her world collapsed does make you think about how thin the line is between authority and criminality. My own transformation through all this was probably the most unexpected part of the whole story. Using the settlement money, I opened a small legal aid clinic specifically for homeowners dealing with electrical code harassment, false inspection threats, and HOA intimidation tactics. Mounting that scorched door in the waiting room wasn't just art. It was proof that homes could be defended. With wiring, with law, with grit. I never built my electrical systems to fight anybody. But sometimes your home becomes the exact place where you finally learn how to stand up for yourself and what's right. 6 months later, the whole neighborhood had transformed. New HOA board, all of Brenda's ridiculous rules repealed, and they built a community garden right where her house used to stand. I teach basic off-grid electrical systems for homeowners there on weekends now. Panels, switches, and how to not get bullied by fake rules. Standing in my weekend classroom hearing children laugh instead of violation notices being delivered, I watch my memorial door stand as permanent proof that regular people can win against corruption when they refuse to back down. Every single time I look at that door, I'm reminded that some circuits overload, some blow out, and sometimes the one who crosses the line ends up learning that voltage bites back harder than they expected. If you've ever been forced to follow completely unreasonable rules by people who think their authority makes them untouchable, just remember, you're not alone in this fight. What's your story of standing up to people like that? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. And if this one hit close, feel free to like, subscribe, or tap that little thanks button under the video. It helps keep stories like this alive here on QA Stories. See y'all next time.
We're QA Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.